Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Morena, everyone. I hope you are having a good week. Today, I am super excited to bring to you my conversation with Zach Bitter. Now, for those endurance athletes out there, this will be a name well familiar to you. So, Zach is an ultramarathon runner. He is a coach, and he's well renowned for his LCHF approach to his diet and other aspects of his training, which may kind of fall outside of your conventional training regime, if you like. So Zach is a bit of a superstar, really. He holds the world records for the 100 miles, completing it in 11 hours and 19 minutes and 13 seconds. And to the 12-hour distance record as well, where he managed to run 104.8 miles in that 12 hours, which is amazing. Zach resides in Phoenix in the States, and today on the podcast we talk about a whole host of things, including why and how he embarked on low carb, high fat, and the benefits that he found, and how that's transitioned over time. That's a super important part. We talked all about his involvement in the FASTER study, how he fuels during an ultra marathon, and at the time of the recording, Zach was preparing for a race called the Desert Solstice Invitational, which was a 24-hour race, his first. And so we talk all about how he managed to fit in 200 miles of week training, in addition to all of the other things he does, including host a super popular podcast, the Human Performance Outliers podcast. And of course, we talked all around his nutrition in and around that. We talk about the benefits of strength training and how he builds that into an already heavy training load, and also talked about his involvement with the charity Fight for the Forgotten, how he's preparing for in 2021, which is this year actually, of course, the Transcontinental Run San Fran to New York event. Now, the race that Zach was preparing for has already been conducted, and he talks all about that on his podcast actually, because that was on December 12th. But sit back, relax, and hopefully you enjoy this incredibly informative conversation that I have with Zach Bitter. And we're on. Zach Bitter, how are you this morning?
Very good. Thanks for asking. How about yourself?
I'm well, thank you. How was your run?
Good. They're seem like they're always present right now. I'm actually training for a 24-hour event in December, and it's going to be, hopefully if things go well, the longest I've ever run continuously. So I'm doing a lot of kind of volume at a relatively low intensity right now. So it's been kind of a fun experience, but it certainly eats up a good chunk of the day.
Mate, I was listening to you on Human Performance Outliers, which is your podcast, which I love tuning into every week, and listening to you discuss what you're doing or what you're currently training for and what you've got kind of coming up in the future. So when I asked, how your run was, it wasn't because I am stalking you on Strava, though I do. I was pretty much thinking the same thing, like you've either come in from a run or you're about to go for a run, but that kind of event, it's sort of unavoidable and amazing.
Yeah, it's fun. It's interesting. I think volume is an interesting component to endurance, and I think it also is such a big picture variable for folks because people will look at my training and they'll think, okay, I need to be doing that if I want to get this result. And really, I usually try to share with folks about kind of starting from where they are and enjoying the process and kind of taking on what I like to call like a micro stressing process, where you're kind of gradually upping that stuff over time and letting your body kind of thoroughly adapt to it before you kind of overreach again, so to speak. So I'm actually kind of in that position in myself right now where I've logged some of the biggest volume training weeks I have to date for this
Yeah.
particular race. So it is kind of an interesting spot to be in. Whereas a lot of the races I've done the last couple of years, I've pushed up to kind of historic volume levels, but haven't really gone too much past them or even past them at all in some cases. So that's the part of the ultra marathon stuff I like the most, though, is kind of you find yourself in positions from time to time where this is a new experience. This is something I've never done before. So you have that big question mark of whether you can actually perform during that situation, and kind of see what happens when you branch out into the unknown a little bit.
Yeah. And, it was funny. I was listening, maybe it was your podcast with Dom D'Agostino actually a couple of weeks ago. And prior to listening to it, I was just chatting to my hubby, Barry, and he's like an ultra runner as well. And we were like going, we're getting older. I think maybe we need to start taking some rest days. And, how do we kind of fit that into our schedule? Then I'm out on a walk and I'm listening to you, Zach, and you're like, yeah, I've just like ticked off a 170-mile week. And I'm like, mate, maybe I'm doing this all wrong. Like, it's massive. How do you actually fit it in? Like, what does your schedule look like on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'm definitely fortunate in that a kind of a huge portion of my work days revolved around the training and racing side of things. So I definitely have a lot more flexibility than when I first got into the sport. When I did my first ultra marathon, I was a full-time teacher, and I did that for about 5 years through 2015. So essentially, the first half of my ultra marathon running career was kind of in the context of a more structured full-time job, which made it a little more difficult. That was a lot of wake up at 4 a.m., run for a couple hours, go to work, go for another run perhaps after work, and then, eat dinner and start thinking about bed, and then just repeat over and over again until the weekend or, a holiday break or a summer vacation or something like that. So for me, though, once I kind of started having some results in the sport and kind of growing my business outside of the actual training and racing side of things, like with coaching and just helping out with marketing initiatives with some of my sponsors, and podcasting as well, it just became a lot more control of my schedule. So I can move things around a lot easier to account for big training blocks. So for me, I definitely have phases of the year where I'm training much less than I am now, where, I might be out there for about 10 hours a week or something like that, which is a lot easier to kind of fit in like a recreational standpoint. For this particular block though, I'm putting 20, 25 hours when you add in like recovery stuff like stretching, mobility, and strength work. There's some weeks where I'm probably pushing up towards 30 hours of actual things related to the act of running and recovering and getting ready for the next session. So that's a lot of time.
Yeah.
But what I like to do with that is, I do like consultations and coaching stuff. So I'm just mindful of my timeline with that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So when I get into the phase of training where I know the volume is going to spike up to that, I kind of hold off on like how many consultations I'll take or how many new coaching clients I'll bring in and things like that. So I can manipulate the schedule a little better. And, thankfully a lot of the other stuff like the podcasting, I can kind of plan around that by recording a bunch of episodes during a lower mileage week. So, people like to look at the big ones like the 170-mile week, the 203-mile week and that stuff, but there was also a 50-mile week in there. So
Yeah.
that helps to have that kind of step back, or that deload week, I like to call it, in there too, where you can kind of focus in on some of the non-running related activities, catch up on that stuff, set yourself up to kind of have the opportunity to really spend a lot more time during the weeks where you build up. And I also kind of look at different areas too, like around the race itself. So my race is December 12th. I'll have a 2-week taper where I reduce the volume significantly. And then I'll probably have 2 weeks after that where I do very little running. So I've got a good 4-week block minus the race day itself to really work on some of those other things that I like to do, and that kind of help my own business and things like that too. But right now it's a lot of, I'll wake up relatively in the morning. Usually for me, it's I wake up between maybe 5 or 6 in the morning, head out for right around 3 hours or so, come back, check emails and things like that, work on some coaching plans, whatever projects I kind of have on the plate, maybe do a podcast, and then, head back out sometime anywhere between early to late afternoon to even early evening for a second run. which usually is followed with some strength and mobility stuff on most days too. So, that's kind of my lifestyle for the last few weeks anyhow.
Yeah, I mean, and you've just probably kind of outlined almost every runner's dream, right? Like it's that whole difference between being a professional and then doing it kind of almost as a hobbyist, if you like, outside of that full-time stuff. And that whole recovery piece is such an important element of it. And I think people often forget that, who aren't professionals, if you like, and they're like, oh, it's always just about the running. And I remember this conversation I had with someone, like this is maybe 15 years ago, and he was an avid runner, and during the summer break he'd like go out on a massive run, and then he'd sit down and just like watch TV, and he'd be like, mate, this is what being a professional athlete must feel like. And I'm like, no, this is probably what being unemployed feels like, because a professional athlete has all of the recovery and the massage and, all of those other things that kind of make up that whole, I suppose, professional element. But also you do have that little bit of additional time. Zach, what I have picked up from like listening to a lot of your podcasts and stuff is that you're a big proponent of strength training for runners. And this isn't something, and as I understand it for you, this is something you've actually done almost all the way through. Is that right?
Yeah, I actually was first introduced to strength training at an early age. I started lifting weights in a more kind of traditional manner in high school, and it was just partly due to wanting to be stronger for whatever reason. In a high school age boy wants to do that. So I was kind of familiar with just the process and some of the technique and stuff like that. But, once I started taking running a lot more seriously, like in college and even post-college, I'd go in and out of kind of doing any type of strength work. I would do it was just maybe a little less structured. And when I would do it, I didn't necessarily have a good why as to why I was doing it, or a good answer as to why I was doing what I was doing. Probably until around maybe 2013, 2014, when I started speaking with some like strength and conditioning coaches and things, and just kind of starting to kind of focus in on, what actually should I be doing as an endurance athlete to leverage strength to benefit me from a performance standpoint, as opposed to just kind of do it because you think you should to stay for stronger for health purposes and things like that. And that's when I kind of started dialing it in a little bit. And as kind of simultaneous with that, I think we've seen a lot more research coming out in favor of strength training. I know, I've had phases of my running career where, some of the, well-known, coaches and folks in the sport would say, hey, it's not necessarily something you need to do a lot of as an endurance athlete, or they see it as something that's pulling you away from the activity that you should be trying to fine tune, or that active running. So the kind of like running joke perhaps was, if you've got time to go to the gym for 45 minutes, you may as well just go out for a run instead. And to a degree that can be true. I think for some folks, especially if they're time crunch, you do have to look at like, what's the primary objective versus what are some of the supplementary activities. And at the end of the day, you do have to kind of work with what schedule you have and things like that. But I do think, there's also a wide range of athletes, both recreationally and professional, who have fairly different training protocols than I do. And some that you skew on the lower end of the mileage spectrum, and they just happen to respond well to that type of a stimulus. Whereas I tend to be a very big volume responder in training in general. And one thing that kind of comes with that territory, in my opinion, is you're skewing more of your running to lower intensity stuff when you start becoming a volume-based runner or a high volume runner. And that type of lifestyle just sets you up kind of to have a lot of like one-dimensional movements or imbalances. Essentially, you can have a lot of effects that kind of affect the development and atrophication of other areas of your body. So, strength training has become something that I really like to do as a way to kind of balance that out and help prevent, some of the overuse injuries and stuff like that can kind of pop up when you have those overdevelopments of certain areas of your body at the expense of others.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's such an important thing as a runner. I mean, obviously I'm a nutritionist and I talk to clients about nutrition, but as an athlete as well, we also chat about what they're doing training wise and things like that. And so many runners, particularly, or endurance athletes, just don't prioritize strength where possibly they should, because it does feel like that added extra. But I I wonder whether, it doesn't have to be that kind of, 3 hours in the gym a week doing strength-based stuff, but working on some of those areas that help support the different range of motion, right? Because as we age, we know that you lose muscle mass, you lose bone mass, and whilst endurance sport actually is quite protective in some of those areas, it's that, if you fall, then you're not reactive and you don't have good balance, or you're not very agile, then that's going to prevent you from kind of doing what you love long term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, you don't have to find yourself in the gym for multiple hours per week. I think a lot of the benefits, when you look at it from a endurance standpoint, come with just like a single day in the gym for like your lower body. So you can get away with something as simple as like probably 30 minutes once a week and see some of those benefits that we see in the research for strength training for endurance athletes. And the way I kind of like to structure it is, if you look at kind of the beginning of a training plan to race day, if you block it in maybe the thirds and kind of have like your base building phase, and then maybe some of the kind of the key workout phase, or I should say maybe a middle section for ultra running, for me anyway, for the longer stuff like 100 miles and further. And it actually kind of looks like a reverse periodized schedule, because I'm doing some of the faster stuff earlier. And the way I like to do it is I do mostly low repetition, higher weight relative to what I can tolerate, compared to what I think a lot of endurance athletes might think of as weightlifting. And my rep ranges are usually kind of like 8 to 10 in those early stages of the training plan. And then I'll kind of scale that down to maybe about 5, 4 to 6, or 5 is usually kind of a good set number, and in the middle of the plan. And then as I'm getting closer to the race itself, or if I'm doing a season where I'm kind of doing some training races leading up during that phase of the year, I'll even come down to maybe 3 reps per set. So when you think about that, if you're doing 2 or 3 sets of anywhere between 3 to 10 reps, it doesn't have to take a lot of time. You can kind of get in and get out with that, and be on with your day and still see a lot of the positive aspects of the strength side of things.
Yeah, sure. And what kind of movements are you doing? Compounds, deadlifts, those kind of things, or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my big focus is compound movements. So I like doing kind of like deadlifts or anything where I'm pulling weight off the ground. I really like to activate kind of that posterior chain. It's one thing I kind of recognized kind of midway through my career, was that that was kind of an issue for me, where like my hamstrings and glutes were quite weak relative to like my quads. So doing those movements like deadlifts and pulling weight off the ground, kettlebell swings, that sort of stuff really kind of helped catch that area of my body up a little bit.
Nice.
Also do things like box jumps, weighted lunges, and things like that as well throughout my training plan from the lower body side of things.
Yeah. And is it fair to say that if your glutes aren't activated, you can pretty much call yourself a runner? Like, isn't that's typically the main thing that almost every physio has said to, well, me and almost every runner that I speak to. It's like, my glutes aren't firing. It's like, well, yes, of course not. You're a runner.
Yeah, you definitely see that a lot.
Yeah. Now, Zach, obviously your when you came onto my radar, in part it was your LCHF approach to running and low carb, high fat, which back at the time, and I may be wrong about this, and I'm thinking it was around 2011 when you kind of embarked on LCHF, but obviously if I'm wrong, you'll correct that. What was it that kind of what was your diet like prior to kind of embarking on low carb, and what encouraged the change for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was kind of near the end of 2011. I had just finished what I would consider my first like full season of ultra marathon racing, where I'd done 350 milers. And, previous to that, I would say probably early on in college, I started paying much more close attention to nutrition in general. So at that point, I was convinced that running was like kind of the sport I wanted to focus on or prioritize. So I just started kind of looking at, well, what is a good nutrition plan for an endurance athlete? And this would have been back in like 2004, 2005, probably. And, back then, and even today, there, a lot of the literature and a lot of the information you're going to find is going to push you towards moderate to high carbohydrate. Obviously, they're going to skew you towards, healthier options within that category if you can. So a lot of like kind of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, that sort of stuff is like kind of the big cornerstone in a lot of those protocols. So that's where I kind of directed my own nutrition at that point in time. And that seemed to work fine as far as I could tell in the, during my collegiate career and some of my running efforts after that, up until the end of 2011, when I did start focusing more on ultra marathon. What I noticed was, some things that had been fairly strength qualities for me started kind of regressing a bit. So like some examples were, up until that year, I had been a really good sleeper where I would basically, when I went to bed, I'd sleep for 8, maybe 9 hours and just be out like a light and wake up the next morning fully refreshed. And then, the day was pretty much, higher, I got pretty consistent energy levels and that sort of stuff. That started to shift. I started finding that I was waking up multiple times a night and having a hard time falling back asleep. And, at one point I was actually blocking off like 10 hours a night for sleep because I knew I was going to need an extra hour plus just to kind of account for like the restlessness side of things. So I thought if I want to get 8 to 9 hours of sleep, I better plan for 10. Other thing I noticed was just big energy swings throughout the day. So I'd wake up and have energy. I'd get my workout done and the workout would feel good. And then I'd probably have like an hour or two after that where I felt pretty energized. Then it'd be like a big dip. And then I'd kind of be on that roller coaster throughout the rest of the day where, I was either like highly energized or felt like I could lay down and take a nap anywhere. So those things didn't necessarily register to me as ideal, not for a sustainability standpoint within the sport. And being new to the sport and young to it, the thought of kind of stepping back or, not targeting my strengths within the training side of things wasn't necessarily the first thing I wanted to try to do. I knew in the back of my mind that maybe would be something I had to consider if I couldn't find other ways to kind of remedy the situation. But thankfully for me, at the same time, I kind of started looking into different nutrition strategies for endurance athletes. And then specifically within endurance athletes, we're focusing on longer events. Like at that time it was 50 miles. Eventually it would become 100 miles and that sort of distance. But I kind of stumbled upon it a little bit by accident. I think I was also feeling a little guilty with how much time I was spending running per week on top of teaching full time. And I discovered podcasts at that time. I was like, this is great. I can, if I spend 2 hours running in the morning, I can learn something along the way. And then even if I feel bad about spending the 2 hours running, at least I can kind of rest at ease knowing I learned something while I was out there doing it. And that's where I kind of first started getting some of the insight into, perhaps focusing on making the foundation of my nutrition fats versus carbohydrates. And, for me, I was fortunate that I was able to get in touch with guys like Dr. Volek and Dr. Finney, who at that time were kind of the couple of the only guys kind of in that space that were like well-known enough that I was able to find them anyway. And they were kind about giving me just some tips and pointers about kind of maybe when and how to implement it. So I went in kind of knowing that this was a pretty big metabolic shift. And with that big of a dietary intervention, that's going to be stressful to a degree for a while as your body kind of adapts to that. So I didn't implement it until after I'd finished my final race that year and was in off-season mode. So I had about a month where my training was basically unstructured. So if I felt like running, I could go for a run. But if I felt like I didn't want to run anymore, I could stop, and it wasn't really going to be something that was going to give me any angst because I wasn't targeting a specific event at the time. And I think that allowed me to probably have a little bit more of a smooth transition into it. So, for me, it was like the first 30 days to a month was basically kind of a little bit of a mix where I'd go out for a run and I'd feel great, feel normal, or I'd go for a run and I would notice this intensity is producing a pace that's a minute to maybe 2 minutes slower per mile at times. Yeah. So had I not known what to expect that, I probably would have bailed on it and just thought, okay, this doesn't work. And I think I see that happen a lot within the endurance running community where people are like, okay, this looks great on paper. They implement it for a couple of weeks, then they decide they don't like it anymore. And certainly there's probably folks who are going to be better served with a different dietary approach to their endeavors. But I think to give it a fair shake, you do want to probably implement it during the off season or a time when you have like a month or two to kind of really kind of find the opportunity to focus in on it and not have as much of that training load stress as you would during kind of the middle of a season or during a peaking phase. So for me, from there, it was kind of like just playing around with how do I individualize this now to my lifestyle versus just kind of plug and play a strict ketogenic diet.
Yeah.
And, along the way, it probably took me about a year and a half to 2 years to really fine tune that, where I found out like, okay, during this phase of training, when I'm periodizing my training this way, this is kind of the macronutrient ratios I'm going to perform best at. And being less about kind of less dogmatic in the sense of being like pro fat, anti carb, or vice versa, and more about how do I improve my fat oxidation rates to the point where I can really lean on those to defend muscle glycogen, but also preserve some ability to take in an exogenous carbohydrate so that I can still pull that lever on race day or for a big workout if I need to or want to.
Yeah.
So I think that's the balancing act. It's not like an all or nothing black or white thing. It's more of a sliding scale. So, I could slide that scale and get my fat oxidation rates up to where I peak out at maybe 2 grams per minute, which would be like off the charts fat oxidation rates, but that might come at the expense of me being able to utilize an exogenous carbohydrate in any way. So if I'm doing a race that's short enough and intense enough where I am going to meaningfully dip into my muscle glycogen, I probably want to be able to defend my muscle glycogen through some exogenous carbohydrate. So then maybe I don't want to slide the scale all the way over to that, that super high 2 grams per minute. But I also don't want to be very low where defending muscle glycogen means I have to be taking in, maybe 60, 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour.
Yeah.
Which for me would be a recipe of disaster at the 100-mile distance. I can maybe get away with that for a 50-miler or a race that takes 5 to 6 hours. But if I'm going to be out there for 12 plus hours, then that sort of fueling is I'm going to give back just as much time from stoppages, from using the bathroom and losing my nutrition and all that stuff, that it wasn't the most direct route for me, at least from my experience. So kind of finding that balance where I could be in a position where my intra-race fueling needs were maybe between 20 to 40 grams per hour was a sweet spot for me. I could almost guarantee, barring something extreme, that I wouldn't have a digestive issue from that low of a fueling intake. But also my fat oxidation rates would be high enough that I wouldn't have to push much past that in order to properly defend my muscle glycogen and still have the energy to kind of have a strong finish to the race versus kind of fading out.
Yeah, sure. And I guess it goes without saying that some of those, the reasons why you were exploring a different nutrition approach, like the sleep issues and stuff, they were resolved once you embarked on LCHF.
Oh yeah, I should add to that. That's that's actually another reason why I kind of stuck to it, I think too, because while I was in that kind of initial 4 weeks or so and noticing a little bit of variance between how my pacing was going during some of those just easy non-structured runs, one thing that changed pretty quickly, like in about a week or so, was I started sleeping consistently through the night. I remember thinking like just waking up surprised one morning because I had slept completely through the night without waking up once. And I woke up that morning thinking, okay, it's got to be like 1 a.m. or something like that. And realizing that it was just a couple minutes before my alarm clock was actually going to go off was kind of a shock to me. And when that started to consistently happen, I knew there had to be something going on that was at least beneficial at the individual level for me.
Yeah.
So that's been kind of a huge piece to the puzzle for me, because I think a lot of times when people think of like performance, they think of like, well, how am I going to make this particular workout faster? But in reality, there's so many different angles to it, because let's say you nail a workout, but then you don't sleep hardly at all that next night. And then it takes you an extra 2 days to recover from that workout, and you have to postpone the next one or push it back. You're not going to accumulate the same amount of training load over the course of your plan if you have that sort of uncertainty in your training. So for me, being able to sleep consistently is huge, because it means I might be able to, fit in 4 or 5 extra quality sessions during a training block that I wouldn't be able to if I was constantly losing sleep. And, over time that adds up to just create a stronger an athlete at the start line of a race.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really liked how you were describing how you periodize your carbohydrate to support your training. And in the back of your mind, you're thinking about things like, how much carbohydrate can I tolerate when I'm out there in a race situation. And, I came across kind of LCHF related stuff and Volek and Finney and their little Bible, The Art and Science of Low Carb Living, brilliant book. And their other sports nutrition one. And I think my understanding and learning has definitely evolved over the years to kind of think, oh, this would be amazing for something like marathon, to thinking, actually, this is far more utility in the kind of events that you're talking about, the ultra marathon style ones where it's individual, but for someone with real gut related issues, if they have to rely on that exogenous fuel source of carbohydrate for an event that is, of any real length, then that is totally going to be a limiting factor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think you're right on. I mean, the context is everything with that, and the intensity of the event certainly plays a big role there. And the marathon, I think, is just such an interesting event because it's the way I describe it. I mean, it's long enough where you have to be conscious of your pacing, but it's also short enough and intense enough where you are going to have some meaningful dips into your muscle glycogen. And it is going to be very oxygen expensive, the intensity at which you race a marathon. So it costs less oxygen to metabolize a carbohydrate than it does a fat. So when you're running at those intensities, that can be a factor. I think more so for kind of the front end of the field where they've got like a lot of their boxes checked already. I think there's still probably some application for like a low carb approach for a lot of folks within the context of more Olympic distance stuff from like 5K to marathon, depending on what their goals are. Or a lot of folks probably have dual or multiple goals versus just having the race of their life. So I think we oftentimes get into a situation where where people either accidentally or intentionally kind of straw man the idea of kind of a low carb approach by, referencing Olympic athletes, where it's like, well, an Olympic athlete's lifestyle is drastically different than the average person's to begin with. So it's not a very clean comparison for, say, someone in their 40s who's training for their first marathon and also working 10 hours a day and has a family. So it's like
100%.
There's a lot of variables to play in. But if you look at it strictly from just like a clean comparison, if you take like me, for example, and just put me across the spectrum of distances and intensities, you're definitely going to notice that purely from a performance standpoint, carbohydrate usage is going to lower the perceived effort. It is going to allow a higher rate of oxygen consumption at those paces that are very vital to like a marathon. So I would have to probably fuel differently if I were going to do something, if I was going to target some of those other distances. But there are also a lot of times distances that don't require a lot of intra-race fueling either. So you remove this huge obstacle or hurdle that is present in a lot of the racing I do, which is digestive issues, where we see, essentially 50, 60% rate of digestive issues of some shape or form for folks who are participating in these events. And, that has to be something you consider when you decide, how you're going to structure a race that you've been preparing for 4 to 6 months.
Absolutely. And I think as well, even though I said with regards to, marathon might not be the best event in terms of not taking on board carbohydrate. You've got your traditional sports nutrition carbohydrate guidelines, which as a practitioner, we recognize really early on that you could never recommend, you might recommend someone take in 6 grams of carbs per kg body weight to 10 grams. But if they're eating that volume of carbohydrate, they can't get it from the good sources, which are promoted, because you just can't eat that volume of food. But then you run the risk of dipping out on the protein and the fat and the nutrients that they provide, right, to help support the recovery and things like that. So there's almost this, it's almost impossible to do the sports nutrition guidelines. But I really like James Morton, I think it's James Morton, the kind of fuel for the work required. So, you support the sessions that require supporting in terms of the carbohydrate intake. And then outside of that, even, a lower carbohydrate approach can still on some days be 150 grams to 200 grams of carbohydrate. It's not necessarily the 20 grams of carbohydrate that is being studied in the science lab that's then proving that this is not a good approach for athletes. It's that real life context versus kind of what you see out there published in literature around how useful or otherwise kind of a keto or low carb approach is.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think it's really interesting. I really like what Dr. Mike Nelson has to say about this sort of stuff, because he says, like, when you start getting to that range where you're looking at like 10 grams per kilo of body weight, I mean, you're skewing yourself to a position where he compares it to having a sports car in the driveway in neutral and just revving the engine. He's like, you're burning that
Yeah.
high octane fuel and going nowhere. So
Yeah.
you have a person in that position who, is maybe training 30 to 50 miles a week. They've got their 9 to 5 job, their family, and they're eating 70, 80% of their diet from carbohydrate. Well, they're revving that engine in the driveway, so to speak, all day long, like while they're sitting on the couch, while they're at work, while they're doing their activity. And essentially you're asking that really small fuel tank that your body has, which is your liver and muscle glycogen, to perform a very, very high percentage of your energy requirements. And, even from the low intensity side of things. So I think it becomes almost an individual question at that point, where you want to ask yourself, well, where are my fat oxidation rates at? Where are my ratios of carb to fat metabolization throughout the spectrum of different intensities? And then start adjusting from there. So, when we look at, like, what is a ketogenic diet, or what constitutes low carb, that kind of is, to me, that's just kind of a lot of noise for the most part.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, it's like, if I eat, say, 150 to 200 grams of carbohydrate in a day, someone who's a lot more sedentary than me and is on a strict ketogenic diet of 20 to 30 grams might think that's a ton of carbohydrate. Whereas a traditional endurance athlete who's, eating maybe 600 plus grams of carbohydrate a day might see that as very, very small amounts. But at the end of the day, it's like my fat oxidation rates are going to tell the story of how my body's going to behave. So, like, if I can produce a fat oxidation rate of 1.5 grams per minute, eating 150 grams of carbohydrates a day, then I'm pretty confident that my fueling program is going to work well for me on race day, and I'm going to be able to defend that muscle glycogen the way I need to in order to have a strong day if everything else kind of plays out for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that your performance and your ability to withstand the training load is really testament that, you're dialing in and you're doing what works for you, right? Because I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the other thing is that, as I understand it, you've been pretty much injury free, Zach, for a lot of your racing career. Would that be right?
Yeah, since I started ultra running, I really haven't had a lot of issues with injuries. I had a bout of injuries early on in college that cost me some seasons. I ended up doing 3 years of cross country and 2 years of indoor and outdoor track and field. And the reason it was 2 years of indoor and outdoor track and field and not three was because I had kind of a string of Achilles tendonitis and IT band syndrome type stuff that kept me off the track for that first year. But yeah, since I started doing ultra running, I've had a couple little things that have just kind of like sidelined me for like a couple of days or maybe a week at the most. And then one injury that I had to take off about 5 to 7 weeks of structured training to kind of get back. But that was the only one that really cost me any events in the grand scheme. So I like to think that that's a pretty good setup for what is now a little over 10 years of ultra marathon running racing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Zach, you mentioned before that the fat oxidation rates is something which, you're using as a bit of an indicator to do what's working for you. Have you always measured that stuff, or was your first kind of, as your first foray into keto, were you measuring that stuff along the way?
Yeah, I wasn't measuring it while I was following kind of a moderate to high carbohydrate diet at any point. If my suspicion is that it probably fell within the parameters that we saw in a lot of the literature, where a lot of folks, they're, getting up to maybe a gram per minute when they're following a moderate to high carbohydrate diet. But who knows? I mean, there's probably some variance there. I know you can train your fat oxidation rate too. It can be something that you can move the needle on independent of your diet or
Yeah.
your macronutrient ratios. In fact, Alan Cousins, he has got a performance lab in Boulder, Colorado, has seen some really interesting stuff with this, with even some of his athletes that are kind of more along the lines of a moderate carbohydrate approach, have seen improvements in their fat oxidation rates by just the timing of it. And I think we're seeing this type of a mindset even move into some of those more Olympic-based events at even the Olympic athlete level, where they're being a little more mindful than just saying carbs are king. I'm going to hammer them day in and day out, in season, off season, rest day, big workout day, and everything in between. and they're looking at it more as like, maybe it's the foundation of their diet, but they can also move that needle a little bit by abstaining from some carbohydrates around some of those lower intensity long sessions or those off seasons where they're not asking nearly as much from their body, and kind of use that to kind of pull that improvement in fat oxidation a little bit. But what we learned in the FASTER study is that, independent of training, dietary interventions are going to move that needle drastically harder or further. So then it just comes down to where you're at. Like if you're somebody who has very low fat oxidation rates and you need to improve them drastically to be able to perform the way you want, a dietary intervention versus just a shifting of macronutrient timing is likely going to be a necessity. And that's going to just be a little bit more of an individual thing from one person to the next. So I think those getting a metabolic test is probably a very useful tool for a lot of people if you can find a spot and get that done. But ultimately that's not an option for everyone. So I do really like using kind of some field tests with my athletes and clients that are kind of leaning more towards like a low carbohydrate nutrition plan. And what I like to do is we'll start to kind of use their long run as kind of like a benchmark as to like where they are at from a fat oxidation rate. Like if I have a client who can go and do say a 4 or 5 hour effort on the weekend, just water and electrolytes and not a whole lot of carbohydrate or no carbohydrate the morning of that session, and feel like their energy levels are very constant, if not higher at the second half of that run, then I'm convinced that their fat oxidation rates are plenty high to be able to kind of start structuring their nutrition plan for race day. And then once we kind of have confirmed that we start practicing what they're going to do on race day from a nutrition standpoint in terms of like what they're going to eat and when they're going to eat it and in what quantity.
Nice. And how often would you recommend your clients kind of practice that race day nutrition in and around their training? Is it every weekend? Is it every couple of weekends? How does that look?
Yeah, so I usually kind of break their long runs. Usually the way I look at it is once I get into the kind of the final third of their training plan, we're starting to really focus the majority of our efforts on building up their long run or their back-to-back long run, depending on how we structure it. So with that side of things, we're usually looking at somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks. So I like to kind of divide it into two, where like half of it we're going to use as like fat oxidation field test. The other half we're going to use as kind of race day nutrition planning. And so depending on if they're doing back-to-back long runs or solos, that can be anywhere from 12 to 16 long runs, or as few as 6 to 8. And that's just kind of how that's kind of how I like to look at it. What we're thinking of with race day fueling too is I like to kind of break it into like, let's have a series of options here. So what's your your fueling A plan, what's your fueling B plan, and what's your fueling C plan? And for most folks, usually they'll lean very heavily on their A plan. That's something that we've seen time and time again in long runs, in previous races, works really well for them. And then usually I like their B plan to be something that they also know has worked, but it's maybe not their number one preference. And what I really like to see is a contrast between their A and B. So if their A is like a liquid, sweet type of a consistency and flavor, I like their B plan to be maybe like crunchy, salty, savory, so that if they kind of get a little bit of a palate fatigue or a sour stomach or something from their A plan, their B one is a nice contrast that is a little more appetizing, so they don't find themselves skewing away from their fueling strategy just due to boredom, palate fatigue, stomach issues, et cetera, et cetera. And most of the time, the A and B is all they really need. C is kind of a little more varied. I like to use aid stations for C plan for myself personally, and a lot of my clients like that as well, where C plan is simply, let's look at the race website or find out kind of what's going to be available at the various aid stations, make sure we know where those aid stations are. And when you're, say, a mile or a kilometer outside of that aid station, start thinking about whether you want to try to use that as an option and go into that aid station knowing, okay, I'm going to be grabbing this, or I'm going to be looking for that. And that's just kind of like a little bit more of a impromptu, like day of, I want a change of pace, or my A and B isn't working for me any longer, and that sort of stuff, just to give them that kind of final option that they have available to them. So they're not necessarily having their race go sideways on them just because they went in there with a single thing that they were thinking they were going to eat the entire day.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I love that because it kind of teaches an athlete a bit of flexibility around their thinking, right? So if it isn't, because there's so much you can't control when you're out there on race day, that if you're not flexible in your approach to nutrition, then the psychological aspect of that could derail you more than or just as much as the gut related issue could derail you.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really funny what motivates you like 70 miles into a 100-mile race too, where you think like, oh, if I use like that aid station at mile 70 where I have like salty potatoes in my drop bag as like a motivator at mile 67, like when you're thinking about that pre-race, you think there's no way that's going to make me run any faster. But then what I see happen a lot of times with that is when you have a situation like that, where let's say they're running, they hit a rough patch at 67, they need to get to that aid station and change their nutrition up a little bit to something a little more savory versus what they had been having. Them hyper focusing on, okay, I just need to get to that aid station to get to that what otherwise would seem like a very, very small incentive, becomes something that causes them to hyper focus on a small benchmark versus the fact that they have 33 miles to run, which I think is really the big derailer for ultra marathons. Is people get into this headspace where they try to wrap their head around what's left. And they're oftentimes doing that too early, because like, even though, 67 miles is a lot of miles on your legs, so you're going to feel that, but 33 miles is still a very long ways to go. So if you find yourself at 67 thinking, how am I going to get 33 more miles done? You're going to mentally and psychologically, shut yourself down and potentially drop out. So having little things like that too, like a variance in your nutrition, so you have something different to look forward to, I think helps people block out the race better and causes them to kind of hyper focus on small goals along the way to kind of get to before they start thinking about the finish line.
Yeah, 100%. And actually that makes me, I have a question here around how you stay motivated to train for the stuff you're training for. So right now you're ticking off, what's your mileage this week, Zach? What will it be?
Let's see. It's what is it today? Tuesday? Tuesday. So I plan my weeks Monday through Sunday, just so I have the weekend kind of all in one week.
Yeah.
Last week I hit 190 miles. I'm trending towards probably about 200 this week. Right. And then I'll have one more week before taper where I'll probably try to push just a little bit past what I'll do this week. So it'll be a lot of running.
Yeah.
Thankfully it's low intensity. I'm targeting between about 7.5 and 8 minute mile pace for the most part, because that's kind of the target pacing I'm hoping to be able to execute on race day. And what I noticed with that is that for me personally, since I do tend to respond a little better to maybe volume on average than I do in like faster intense stuff. When I do the faster intense stuff, I got to be a lot more careful with how much volume I'm doing. Whereas it seems like I can really, really pile on a lot of low intensity volume without like a big increase in injury risk. So that's actually been a pretty kind of like promising aspect of this training plan, as I'm learning even more about that side of things, about how my body kind of responds to some of these kind of freakishly large training blocks.
Yeah. And how do you stay motivated? Do you have any mental strategies that you use if you wake up at 5 and are like, mate, I've got to go out and do a 3-hour run? It's the last thing I feel like.
Well, I'll tell you this, the last thing you want to do is, if you have 3 weeks of buildup, on day 2 of that, don't start thinking about that last day. It was funny. I actually finished a run. I think it was maybe last night or Sunday, or I can't remember. I got done. And my wife Nicole's an ultra marathon runner as well, so she can very much appreciate and understand kind of what I'm doing. So I come back, I'm like, oh, it feels good to have that one done. And I look at the clock, I'm like, but I just got to do it all over again tomorrow. So I think that is the hard part, is both just the timing of it, or like the scheduling of it, trying to make it fit within like your schedule, so that you're not neglecting every other aspect of life. But also just, the mental side is pretty tough, knowing like, okay, I just ran 20 miles this morning. In, a handful of hours, I'm going to go out and run 10 more. and then it's not going to be that much longer till dinner. And then after dinner, I have to start kind of thinking about what I'm going to do the next day. And that's going to include another 20 miler right away in the morning. So I think that is the hard part. What I like to try to do though, is just look at every one of these runs as kind of like one brick or one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And just think about, I can't move on to the next piece of the puzzle, the next brick, until I lay this one or place this one. So when I think of it like that, it allows me to kind of stay in the moment a little bit, which is a little easier for me to wrap my head around.
Yeah.
And I think one thing I've gotten a lot better at throughout my career, and mainly in the last couple of years, is being able to really kind of hyper focus on what I'm doing at the moment versus overthinking what's coming up and having that kind of create this negative psychological state where I'm, losing motivation to kind of get through this workout because I know what's coming up is going to also be challenging. And, the other thing I really like with the motivation side of things is when you're building like a program, you might be building from 4, maybe even 6 months out. So when you first look at, okay, this race, here's my plan, that motivation is super high on week 1 because it's new. You just got done making the plan. You're excited. You're ready to kind of put in the work. Your body's fresh. Your mind is fresh. And you just kind of assume it's going to be that motivating throughout. But what I find is if your only carrot is that race at the end, then you're going to have a very hard time staying motivated and staying consistent through the training because there's just not enough reward built into the program. So I like to look at the program as a whole at first while I'm planning it, or at least have that scaffolding laid out as to how I expect it to kind of go, but then also build in benchmarks along the way. Like that's actually maybe one of the biggest mental benefits I think of a deload week. So if I'm going to do, say, a 3-week buildup, I'm on week 2, I've got a light at the end of the tunnel, knowing at the end of the 3rd week, I get to take a step back, let everything catch back up before I kind of make another push towards getting everything set up for race day. So I think kind of having those small benchmarks built into the plan itself is a lot easier to kind of, stay motivated throughout.
Yeah, absolutely. And Zach, are you pushing the fat oxidation rates right now with this low intensity training and keeping your carbs lower? Like, what does your nutrition look like at the moment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because I think when you start getting up to 24 hours, now we're in a world where I think even a strict ketogenic diet has that potential application as, at worst, a neutral performance, if not a benefit to some degree. So for this, since it's basically about twice as long as what I would normally do on a track for a race, it does open up the opportunity for me to kind of focus even less on carbohydrates as what I would maybe do for like a 100 miler or a 50 miler or a 100K or something like that. So the biggest difference nutritionally during this peaking phase than ones in the past is I have been just keeping my carbs a bit lower. I think I'm rarely touching even 100 grams right now. So when you think about that in the context of the volume I'm putting up, it's basically classic ketogenic low. I'm keeping around probably just enough carbohydrate so that I'll be comfortable digesting it on race day. I'll still use a little bit of carbohydrate on race day, although I will scale back on that as well, since the intensity that I'll be doing during the event is going to be relatively low. One thing I have been paying attention to is where my kind of heart rate is settling at these paces, because I'm burning like such a high level of fat when I'm at kind of like maybe 130 beats per minute of heart rate, that it's to defend muscle glycogen through exogenous carbohydrate. I just don't need all that much at all.
Yeah.
So versus like the 150, maybe even 155 at times that I'm going to average during a 100-mile race, where at that level of intensity, I'm going to be dipping into that muscle glycogen a little bit more quickly. So 100 grams is kind of about where I'm peaking at the moment. And that seems to be working quite well. I don't feel like I'm, lacking energy or motivation or anything to hit these paces. And my training may be a little different than some folks are looking at from an endurance buildup, where there are a lot of traditional endurance events. You're going to probably need multiple systems during race day even. So you kind of have to keep in a little bit more variety in your workouts. Like if you think of just a standard hard, easy, hard training schedule that a lot of endurance athletes are going to use for like 5Ks, 10Ks and that sort of stuff. They might do short intervals one day. They might do like a tempo or lactate threshold type workout on another day, and then a long run on the weekend, and then kind of continue through that process. So they're kind of hitting like their VO2 max system on the short intervals. They're hitting their lactate threshold on that tempo run, and then they're tapping into their kind of aerobic threshold on the long run day. And for me, it's a little different because I have to, like, I'm never going to touch my VO2 max, hopefully on race day, unless it's the last 5 minutes of that race. So I'll do those workouts, but I'll do them much earlier in the training.
Yeah.
And those are the type of workouts that are going to take a big chunk out of like my muscle glycogen. Whereas if I go out this morning and run 20 miles at an average heart rate of 125 beats per minute, I might not even see much of a dip in my muscle glycogen. So I'm not looking to I'm not looking to defend that as much from exogenous sources during this. I'm just looking to keep enough around that I'm able to tolerate it when I use it on race day.
Yeah, sure. And has your body comp changed at all with the increase in volume, or are you able to kind of match your eating to support the effort?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I noticed maybe like the first big block I did that I got down to maybe about the lowest weight that I usually feel comfortable from a performance standpoint. From me, historically, if I start dipping down kind of around 135 pounds or so, that's where I start noticing that I'm really it's negatively affecting performance. I've kind of like overrun the power weight ratio stuff, and it's going to vary from event to event. Like obviously, like it's going to be different. You need different power output for like a 5 kilometer versus a 24 hour, and a different power output for 100 miles versus a 24 hour, and all these other comparisons you could make. And I was dipping down kind of close to that, which is, for me, that's kind of a sign like, okay, I need to make sure I'm getting a little more food in, because if I go any lower than this, then it's going to be, potential for disaster or just poor performance and that sort of stuff. So when I did the deload week, I definitely overate on the deload week, which was probably just a good reset holistically outside of just the reduction in training. And now I have just a little better of a grasp of kind of how much I need to be consuming to kind of stay kind of between 135 and 140 pounds, which is a pretty good spot for me for the intensity at which I'll be racing at Desert Solstice in December. And
Nice.
it is kind of shocking how much food it is, though. Like,
talk me through it, Zach. What does it look like?
Well, my typical eating pattern that I found just like I prefer has been kind of like, I like larger meals and less frequent eating. I don't always go that route. I definitely am. I'm usually able to get away with kind of eating intuitively, and that usually finds me right where I need to be, where if I'm hungry, I don't abstain. And, if I'm full, I don't force feed myself. And then outside of kind of like peak training, I don't have to do a whole lot of force feeding. But for this one, I'm basically like, all right, this needs to be a 2,000 calorie meal. And then I probably need to eat something between this one and my next meal. And then dinner has to be sometimes 3,000 calories. So it is a lot more food, which just for me means like scaling down the volume per calorie of the food I'm eating. So I'm just doing a lot more things that are high calorie, low volume, in order just to kind of not feel like I'm constantly full or bloated and stuff from all that food intake. The way it's looked for me is I'll usually wake up in the morning. I'll have like a cup of coffee with like either like cream, like heavy whipping cream, or I'll use this product by my nutrition sponsor, S Fuels, that's called S Fuels Life. And it's just basically like a powder that's got like medium chain triglycerides and stuff in it. And I'll put that in there. I'll have an S Fuels Life bar, which is basically a protein bar before I go out. I don't like to have too much before I run typically, but with these low intensities and the amount of calories I'm burning during this type of training, it's almost a necessity in order to not have to force feed myself later in the day. When I get back, I'll usually make like I'll use some oil on a pan, and then like 6 eggs, maybe like 4 or 5 ounces of cheese, I'll have maybe another like S Fuels protein bar on top of that, maybe some yogurt. That's been pretty standard. Then usually, I'll be good for a few hours, and if I'm kind of starting to get hungry before my second session out, I'll try to stick to kind of more liquid calories if I can, just so I'm not filling up my stomach before heading back out there. For that, I like S Fuels Train. It's a powder. It's essentially the same as like a carbohydrate powder that you'd mix in with like your drink, but it's fat based. So
Hmm.
when I'm staying away from carbohydrates, I really like that. If I am going to do a carbohydrate source during a run, then I'll use S Fuels Race Plus, which is their product that has like small amounts of fat and protein in it, but it also has like 14, 15 grams of carbohydrate. So usually a
Hmm.
packet or two of that on a really big training day is all I'll really need for this intensity. And I like to blend, I like to get my carbs from that, even when I'm doing lower carbohydrate stuff, just because that is going to be my primary carbohydrate on race day. So
Yeah.
for me, like practicing that during runs is definitely something that I'm trying to be mindful of. Then I'll get back from that run, and dinner could be anything from salmon, eggs, beef, steak, all sorts of different stuff like that. I'm probably a little more diversified at dinner. I'll steam up some like broccoli or some vegetables like that I can just like kind of layer on, extra virgin olive oil, salt, cheese, anything that's high calorie, low density to go with that. Yeah, and then I basically just that's kind of my main meal, and then like I'll be snacking on basically fatty protein based type things throughout the rest of the evening until I go to bed for the most part.
Yeah, nice. And are you a beer man, Zach?
I'm not a huge fan of beer, which is like a crime for being from the state of Wisconsin, where they really love their beer.
Yeah.
I'm not opposed to some adult beverages. I just tend to lean towards like whiskey and that sort of stuff a little bit more, from a preference standpoint. So I will have some of that too from time to time. I'm mindful of the quantity of it, just because, you know, from a recovery standpoint, it's probably not doing me a whole lot of favors. So, after that second run in the afternoon, every once in a while, I'll pour myself a drink, but it's not super common.
Yeah. And favorite meal?
Favorite meals, probably, I would say it's a toss up between like a ribeye steak,
Mm.
um, or I really like eggs, and I go through phases with eggs where I'll be eating them a lot and I'll just get in that rhythm. And for whatever reason, I've hit that during this training block, where I've had some days where I've eaten over a dozen eggs in a day, because I'm having like six in the morning and then six again in the evening. And it's just like you go to the grocery store. My wife and I were actually joking around about that, because we kind of had our grocery list item, and we've been just a little more dialed in with it this last
Yeah.
year, because with COVID and everything, we're trying to be mindful of how many times we go to the grocery store. And because in the past, like I've got a grocery store right across the street from where our house is, so we've had times where I'd go over there maybe 5 times a week, just because then I could kind of pick what I wanted on the day and I didn't have to plan ahead.
Yeah.
But during this, we're trying to limit it to once a week if we can. So we had kind of our list of kind of our go-to stuff that we knew about how much we would need for a week. And then I started kind of doing these high volume training, and we noticed it's like, okay, we can't get away with like two blocks of cheese. We're gonna have to get 4 blocks of cheese. Or we
Yeah.
the 18 or 36 eggs isn't going to be enough. We're gonna need 72 eggs.
The people at the grocery store will be like, oh, those bidders must be having a party or
Yeah.
catering for a large event with all those eggs.
Yeah, the competitive eater or an ultra runner, which one is it?
Hey, Zach, just another couple of questions, if it's all right. Are you still using your continuous glucose monitor?
Yeah, so that's something I've been kind of using new. I'm learning quite a bit from it, actually. And I had it, I'm working with a company called Levels, and they sent me like two 14-day patches essentially. And
Mhm.
the first 14 days, I just put it on and was like, I'm just going to do what I normally would do, and just get a feel for like what is happening in my body when I kind of just do what I have been doing to date, and kind of just take a little inventory on that and kind of just get a gauge, and then do the next 14 with maybe a little more of a strict data collection standpoint, and a little more like just like trial stuff where I'm going to really try to identify what is causing what.
Mm.
So some of the interesting things I learned from that first round of 14 days is sleep is a pretty big one when it comes to my glucose response anyway. I had a day where I didn't get very good sleep. And it was like my spikes were much higher. The glucose tended to hang up there a little longer than they would in the past, or on the other days. So that kind of stood out to me. The other thing I noticed was, for me, like I get almost like a little bit of a preemptive glucose spike in the morning when I wake up. I wake up and then it's like, I think it might be something to do with just the fact that the majority of my life now I've woke up in the morning and gone for a run or a workout. So it's like my body's almost tuned to know, like, within about an hour of waking up, I'm going to be out there running or doing some sort of physical activity. So usually, I'd wake up and it would be maybe 80 milligrams on the glucose reading thing. And then it might creep up even to 100 or something like that right before I head out. And then it would kind of creep back down a little bit during the run. And then since I have these large meals that I'm eating, I'll notice what I get is sometimes I'll get a not a massive spike, but I'll get a good spike after my meal and then it comes straight back down. So like if you look at my thing, it's like kind of flatline, and you could see like, oh, there's the two big meals because it's like ding ding, and then it goes like flatline again and then ding ding. And then so I was talking with the guys at Levels actually last week, and they were telling me a few things I could try to see if that would alter that at all without actually changing the diet at all. And a couple things were either, eat slower and do some light movement after the meal and see if that kind of brings it down. I'm going to play around with it. I'm not too concerned though, because I'm not like spiking out a range or anything like that. It's still typically like, under 140, and then it comes down right away. It doesn't hang out up there for a long period of time. So I'm definitely like, it's definitely got good control, but I'd be curious just to see kind of what it does, as well as just kind of like what food pairings are doing what. So like one thing is like, when are you having carbohydrates and fiber and proteins and fats within the meal? So like one thing I'm kind of curious about is like, if I have a meal where I am going to have a little bit of carbohydrate, so say I have like a potato with that meal, if I eat the potato first, what does that do to my glucose response versus having it at the very end? Or what happens if I mix it all together in kind of like a dish and eat it all kind of simultaneously, and just kind of tease out like where things are for me. And then also just like what is giving me specific responses versus what the norm might be, because there does seem to be I always remember Rob Wolf's example where he and his wife were measuring glucose, and she would eat like a cookie and get barely any movement on her glucose, whereas he'd eat the cookie and it would shoot up like above 150. And then he'd eat a banana and get very little movement. She'd eat a banana and it would spike way up. So it's like, I think we're going to learn a ton from some of this continuous glucose stuff over the years as they get more available to people, and learn a lot more about just like what it is, like what is healthy from one person to the next, and where is the context for someone like me who's, running as much as I am versus like someone who's maybe doing like a strength-based sport, or maybe not any sport at all, or maybe they're just going to the gym for health purposes and things like that. So I think it'll be some interesting stuff coming out from all this.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I often think back to, like, as a university student, when I was studying nutrition, we were one of the labs in Australasia that were doing the original glycemic index studies on foods. And so we'd rock on up in the lab. We were told not to run. We were told, to eat similarly or not eat beforehand. But as uni students, we weren't as interested in scientific rigor as we were in getting the $15 or whatever it is they paid us to do the study, So I'd run sometimes beforehand. I wouldn't run the other times. And obviously, data like that helps form something which is like the glycemic index, which is supposed to tell us a little bit about how that food is going to impact on blood sugar. But that information can't come from the food source itself. It's so much more about the person eating it, right? And the individual factors that impact on that blood sugar. And what you say with regards to the eating order of food, I think there is some good research, isn't there, to show that if you do eat protein before the carbohydrate, that's going to change that postprandial kind of response. And also maybe things like raw apple cider vinegar on your food, that might change your blood sugar response.
Mhm.
Having that little bit of movement post meal might change it too.
Isn't cinnamon supposed to be something that brings it down too? That's something I haven't tried. I didn't try it during the 14 weeks, but partly because I wasn't eating a whole lot of food that cinnamon necessarily went with, I guess. But
Yes.
I might try that too. I'm gonna try a few different things. I think that are kind of historically ones that impact that and see what happens. But the other one that I saw interesting that I thought was like mangoes versus apples. I guess a lot of people have a much lower response from mangoes versus apples.
Ah,
So I think it might be something to do with the fiber content,
yeah,
but
interesting.
that and the timing of it too. I think like it's funny because when you think of the way like a meal is structured, a lot of times you'll have like kind of like a side salad as like kind of that initial dish before you get your main course.
Yeah.
And even that's basically like low calorie fiber for the most part, unless you're putting a bunch of stuff on it. So it's almost like it's setting you up to like be ready for the main course and then dinner, and then if you have dessert afterwards, it's like the bulk of the carbohydrates are going to be in that kind of post dinner dessert, which would be better on your glycogen response, or I'm sorry, your glucose response. Um, so it's just funny how that stuff ends up kind of like being structured in a way that tends to be like the appropriate way to do it. And then they serve it like kind of on a timeline too, where it's like, you can't really just like, what I find interesting is like, I'll come back from these runs and I'll either have something to get to or just be hungry and I'll eat way faster than I probably should.
Yeah.
And when you go to a restaurant or something, you sit down, it's like there's no real way to do that. You're gonna basically kind of have to eat at the pace at which your stuff comes out. So it's almost like thinking of it like that, thinking of eating that way is a way to slow it down, and maybe going for a walk after dinner or something like that is supposed to be a good way to keep it down. But yeah, the other interesting thing I saw in that first 2 weeks too was I had a couple times where my glucose dipped really low during a run. Actually, I talked to
Mm.
Dom D'Agostino about this too, where I dipped down into like the 50s, which he said would normally flatline someone
Yeah.
or they'd pass out essentially. And, I'm in the middle of a run. And
Yeah.
when I would see that, I was like, I would just take inventory about kind of how I felt. And being completely transparent, like I didn't feel like I wanted to go and do like sprint intervals or anything like that, but I didn't feel like it was really that much more difficult to be running at the low intensities that I was. So whether that's some sort of variance that we will start seeing in kind of folks who are living a lifestyle like I am from a training standpoint, or if it's
Yeah.
also something to do with at that part of the day where I'm on my second run, I'm probably about 45 minutes into it. I'm probably burning about as high fat as I am at any point during the day at that point too. So it may just not be as, it could just be my body shifting to burning like higher amounts of fat at that intensity at that time frame. And it's not really an issue for me to have my glucose dip that low versus someone who's very dependent on that and would have a hard time functioning in those parameters.
Yeah, totally. Like it was like if you felt fine but just didn't have like, bounds of energy, then it doesn't sound like it would necessarily be a problem. I can't remember, Zach. I remember you asked Dom whether or not some sprinting to
Oh
help
yeah.
encourage that. Because that when you asked him that question, I'm like, yeah, actually it's a great idea. What did he say about that?
Um, I want to say he said that might not be something that would register because if I do like a fast sprint, my body's going to go straight to muscle glycogen to fuel that effort
Yeah.
versus mobilizing like glucose into my blood. Because my thought was if I do that high intensity sprint, what that will do is will force my liver to like release glucose, and then I would see that from 50 kind of maybe move up to 70 or 80 or something like that on the reader. But I think I may have been just not understanding exactly. Like Dom probably, well, Dom definitely has a better understanding of this stuff than I do. So I haven't tried it yet, though. I might give it a go if I come across that low reading again during a run and just force myself through some short intervals and see what happens if it pumps it back up or not. But it might be hard to tell too, because even when I'd have those dips, usually when it would go down that low, it would creep back up
Yeah.
over the next few minutes or the next 10, 15 minutes. So then it becomes hard to tease out whether it would have done what it ends up doing on the meter anyway, or if it would have stayed lower had I not done the sprinting.
Yeah, it's so interesting because that's where my brain went to. And yeah, you're probably right. Not about you not being smart enough, but when in my head, I'm like, yeah, I just don't know enough about this stuff. And Dom sounds like he knows what he's talking about. And obviously he does.
Yeah.
Um, with
And
that.
he's done a lot of work with the continuous glucose monitors for
Mm.
himself personally too. I know on his Instagram page, he's always posting stuff about like what he sees in terms of response to certain things. So it's always interesting to follow what he's up to. He's a cool N of one.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's the thing with this stuff is that we're all different. And I think you've put in such a lot of work, Zach, into figuring out what works for you, which is, which people might think, oh, that should just be the realm of a professional athlete because it's all part of the job. But actually, I think any athlete is going to get more from their sport and more from their overall health if they take a bit of that and kind of put it into place. And that's why when I work with people, I'm like, yes, this is what the science might tell us, and this is what this other person here is doing. But actually, we've just got to figure out what parts of those things are going to kind of suit you, or is it something entirely different? So I think everyone kind of has to take that N of one approach, really, eh?
Yeah. I I really like the individualized side of nutrition, especially when we're talking about performance. I think it's fine to focus on what like research and what some of these studies have shown in, certain things as a starting point. But ultimately, my hope with some of these like biofeedback devices, like continuous glucose monitors, like Aura Ring type things, where you can get like data on your sleep quality and stuff. As that stuff improves and becomes more accessible by the average person, then just the amount of information you can find that's unique to you can put you in a position to either go with that or try to make any type of like meaningful alterations in order to maybe improve whatever's going on if you want to try to like stick to whatever kind of pattern of eating you're doing. But yeah, I think with when you have something like nutrition, which I always make sure I comment like when it comes to studies and things along the nutrition lines, I do not envy those folks because there's just so many confounders that are built into even the best studies you can do.
Mm.
And at the end of the day, they got to come up with a couple questions to try to answer. And inevitably, there's going to be a ton of eyes on that want hundreds of questions to be asked and answered. So, you're just never going to get a clear, absolutist, this works for everyone type of an answer from any of this stuff. And ultimately, I think what that means is we need to be mindful of what is available from like a research standpoint, but then
Yeah.
also be willing to kind of work at the individual level for yourself to kind of find what's going to work best for you. That's what I've done, and I think it's been a huge portion of kind of where I found my progress in sport and life.
Yeah, awesome, Zach. I wholeheartedly agree. Um, Thank you so much for taking the time out to speak to me today. I super appreciate it. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the results of your 24-hour. Good luck with that. And then, of course, also going to look forward to your progress updates on your San Fran to New York epic mission that you've got for 2021.
Yeah, that's a big project that I've got on the calendar at the moment. I'm targeting September of 2021. I'm going to try to run from San Francisco to New York.
Right.
Uh, Currently, Pete Kostelnik has the record. He averaged, I think, like 72 and a half miles a day. Just mind boggling. So it's going to be a very tough one to try to stay on top of, but that'll be kind of the top end goal of the effort. But ultimately, regardless of however many miles per day I am able to average. My number one goal is to raise as much awareness for a charity called Fight for the Forgotten that helps build wells for the Pygmy tribe in the Congo, as well as farms and homes now too for them. And they're also partnering to kind of develop another arm to that charity, which is going to help develop curriculum for kind of school children up through the high school level in terms of like, trying to solve some of the like, uh, bullying and things like what causes it, how do we help folks who are both in the position of being bullied as well as help understand better why someone would be doing that sort of stuff in the first place, because I think sometimes it's maybe not quite as clear as we would like it to be. So I just think it's a great cause. Justin Wren, the founder, is one of the kindest human beings I've ever met, so it'll be definitely a big motivator while I'm out there trying to make my way from San Fran to New York.
Yeah, awesome. And can you just tell folks where best to find more information about that, and also where to find you on the interwebs? Where do you kind of hang out most?
Sure. Yeah. So in terms of information on the TransCon, there's not a ton of information for my particular effort yet. I'm still very much kind of planning and getting it all set up. In terms of just the historic presence of that route, if you just Google Transcontinental Run or Pete Kostelnick's TransCon Run, there'll be a lot of information that comes up. You'll be surprised how many people have actually done it and how far back it dates to as well. So that's kind of a fun one. If you're interested in what I'm up to, kind of the one-stop spot that'll kind of link you to everything is my website, which is ZachBitter, ZachBitter.com. I'm probably most active on Instagram and Twitter, which is at ZachBitter and at ZBitter.
Awesome. Zach, thanks so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Cheers. There you go, team. So that was my convo with Zach. He was awesome, as you can see, and such a professional with regards to being able to just share lots of really useful information. And you can certainly see that whilst, he has a particular way of approaching his training, his nutrition, and why it benefited him, he certainly knows zealot when it comes to what might benefit his clients. And you can find Zach Bitter at his website, ZachBitter.com, also over on Human Performance Outliers, and you'll find him on Insta and Twitter at ZachBitter, at ZBitter. And next week on the podcast, I have a super interesting conversation with Dr. Mikki, all about the low energy availability in athletes and the progression of the female athlete triad to encompass other elements of athlete health and, of course, male athletes. And so we talk all about relative energy deficiency in sport. So if that's a topic that you're interested in or that you want to learn more about, absolutely tune in next week. Until then, though, if you like this episode and all of the episodes, please go over to your favorite podcast platform and subscribe and leave a 5-star review, because that just raises the awareness of this podcast out there. And I certainly don't take for granted that you guys have taken the time to listen to what I bring to the table and my guests bring to the table, because it is certainly a contested field out there for what goes in your earphones every week. Until then, though, you can get hold of me on Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, on Instagram and Twitter at Mikki Williden, and I share all sorts of things over there. You can also contact me via my website at mikkiwilliden.com, and if that's one way that you would love to support the podcast, absolutely sign up to my nutrition coaching online. And I know many of you have asked me how you might want to do that, so that gives you access to weekly emails, meal plans every month with shopping lists, the ability to ask me questions at any time that I see and respond to, and also our weekly forums that we have on our members only Facebook page. And in addition to that, I do actually have a joint collaboration that will be ready for February called Shreduary, along with Rebecca Keat and Siri Linley from Team Sirius. And so you can find out more information about that in the coming weeks as well. Until next week, though, team, have a fab week and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for listening.